Okay, I am back and I have a little bit of time to read up on George V and the Irish settlement. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. But Ireland has a very long and complicated history with King George V, and he did work on trying to reconcile some of the issues with Ireland. Um, He attempted to insist in the reconciliation of the Irish Home Rule crisis. So, and that was occurring right as the Great War was being undergone, and England was fighting a war with Germany. So, it's a complicated history. So, I'll get started. Peace with Ireland. It took longer. The postponement of Home Rule for the duration of the war was accepted by John Redmond. Others seized on the decision as a breach of faith that it invited retaliation by violence. The failure of the Easter Rising of 1916, the execution of Sir Roger Casement, and the imposition of military conscription infected those volatile minds with bitterness and illusions of betrayal. Conciliatory attempts to resolve the differences between North and South and by all party conventions failed as decisively as the Buckingham Palace Conference 3 years earlier. At the general election of 1918, Eamon de Valera's Sinn Féin party won 73 of 105 Irish seats at Westminster, and they declared Ireland as an independent republic and embarked on a campaign of terrorism and murder against British rule. So, let's just bring up. Okay, that's a pretty good depiction right here of England and Ireland. So, if you can see that. That is right there. As you can see, it's England with Scotland in the north, and it's got a rope up here in the northern part of Ireland, the Prosperity Province, and England is still tied to Ireland. And over here, the southern part, it includes the Land League, Maynooth Province, Poverty Province. Ulster's prayer says don't let go. And over here it says Home Rule rocks. So, and it is separated here by, it doesn't take long to go from Scotland to Belfast. I met some people who said it took like an hour, maybe hour and a half on their flight. But as you can see, they offer, from Northern Ireland, they offer ferries that go straight into Scotland or straight over here into Wales. So it's not that far off. So that's what that's about. It's a complicated history with Ireland. And just to read you a little bit about, in my British history book, See, over here is my British history book. Somebody got this for me and I just love it. But the Irish Free State. It's an independent state and it's formed in Ireland. It has less than 6 counties in Ulster. In 1922, with Dominion status and an oath of allegiance to the crown, the refusal of many to accept the oath led to the Irish Civil War, in which the Republicans were virtually stamped out, and leaders like Michael Collins, who had signed the treaty with the British, were killed. In 1932, when De Valera came to power, the process of dismantling the Free State had begun, with the Oath of Allegiance abolished in 1933 and a new constitution in 1937, changing the name of the Irish Free State to Eire, E-I-R-E. In 1949, Eire became the Irish Republic. So that's quite interesting. And again, it's got a long, complicated history with the Irish Civil War occurring between 1922 to 1923. It even goes back to Queen Victoria's time with the potato famine and the corn laws. It's just a very long and complicated history. But it's a beautiful country. So if you ever have a chance to go, I would go. But this is something that George V was happening under George V's reign as a monarch. And at the same time, he was dealing with the Great War. To reinforce a hard-pressed army and police force, the government sent over a body of ex-servicemen whose methods of reprisal were no more honorable or humane than those of their opponents. Dubbed the Black and Tans, from their distinctive uniforms, they were loathed in Ireland and looked on with mistrust from Westminster. The king, who increasingly came to see himself as the father of all his people, King George agonized over the bloodshed and the cruelty, some of it self-inflicted. He found no comfort in his prime minister, who thought that the king was taking an altogether too detached view of the struggle. During the prolonged and eventual fatal hunger strikes of Terence McSweeney, Lord Mayor of Cork, Lloyd George wrote unpleasantly, "The king is an old coward. He is frightened to death and is anxious to make it clear that he has nothing to do with it." A more accurate reflection of the king's opinion can be found in a letter written by Stamfordham only 5 days earlier. The king feels that the probable result arising from McSweeney's death will be far more serious and far outreaching than if he were taken out of prison and moved into a private house where his wife could be with him, but kept under strict surveillance so that he could not escape and return to Ireland. Abused behind his back by Lloyd George for timidity, the king was reproached to his face by Ponsonby for callousness. "The king and I had a fierce argument on Ireland, which ended in a yelling match," that insubordinate royal servant told his wife. "I supported Asquith, Grey, and Robert, and Cecil," he, the prime minister. In 1920, Lloyd George took a new initiative. The Government of Ireland's bill established 2 Irish parliaments with limited power, one to be in Dublin and one to be in Belfast. Although repudiated by the South, the measure was welcomed by the leaders of the Protestant North, who invited the king to open their new parliament in June 1921. Others warned him that his presence in Belfast would antagonize Dublin, even expose him to physical danger. Those fears he dismissed. He would turn a ceremonial duty into a mission for peace. It has since been said that the king was in effect challenging his intransigent ministers. This is a mistaken interpretation. The speech with which he opened the new Parliament of Northern Ireland, like those he delivered over the years at Westminster, had been prepared in Downing Street and approved by the cabinet. His only departure from the custom lay in persuading the government to cast his speech in the form of a personal appeal for reconciliation in Ireland. General Smuts, who happened to be in London for the Imperial Conference, may be credited with implanting the visionary plan in the king's mind and producing an early draft of the speech. But the text from which the king spoke was at work of Sir Edward Grigg, later Lord Altrecham, one of the Prime Minister's private secretaries. Originally a journalist in the Times and affectionately dubbed the Scribe during his wartime years in the Grenadier Guards, he now brought exceptional gifts of insight and sympathy to his composition. On the 22nd of June, 1921, with the Queen at his side, the king pronounced this striking peroration. The eyes of the whole empire are on Ireland today, the empire in which so many nations and races have come together in spite of the ancient feuds, and in which new nations have come to birth within the lifetime of the youngest in the hall. I am emboldened by the thought to look beyond the sorrow and anxiety which have clouded of my late vision of Irish affairs. I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards the end of strife amongst her people, whatever their race or creed. In that I hope, I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of the forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and to forget, and to join in making for the land they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill. It is my earnest desire that in Southern Ireland, too, there may be a time to take place a parallel to which is now passing in this hall, that there are similar occasions that may present itself, and a similar ceremony to be performed. For this the Parliament of the United Kingdom has in the fullest measure provided the powers. For this the Parliament of Ulster is pointing the way. The future lies in the hands of my Irish people themselves. May this historic gathering be the prelude of the day in which the Irish people, North and South, under the one Parliament, or two, as those parliaments may themselves decide, shall work together in common love for Ireland upon the sure foundation of mutual justice and respect. I think it is my speech was appreciated, the king wrote. I never heard anything like the cheering. The Prime Minister came to welcome him at Euston Station and was unusually effusive in his congratulations. That did not deter the king from sending Stamfordham to number 10 2 days later with both a warning and a complaint. The private secretary urged Lloyd George to take immediate advantage of the improved atmosphere in Ireland. The moment was a very fleeting one, he continued, especially when dealing with a quick-witted, volatile, and sentimental people. Lloyd George agreed in assuring him that the cabinet was about to invite De Valera and Sir James Craig, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, to meet in London. Stamfordham went on to deplore the minatory tone of Birkenhead's speech on Ireland in the House of Lords on the very eve of Belfast's ceremony. as well as Churchill's unhelpful statement in the Commons promising military reinforcements. Lloyd George replied that the line taken by the Lord Chancellor would emphasize what the king had done was His Majesty's actions, independent of the government and thus carrying its own popular appeal. An artful response from the Prime Minister that concealed by flattery what he knew to be constitutionally untrue. After much prevarication, de Valera accepted Lloyd George's invitation to talks in London, and on July the 10th, a formal truce was signed by the British forces in Ireland and the Irish Republic Army. The terms offered to de Valera for a permanent settlement were more generous than could have been envisaged at any time during the previous decade. What amounted to full dominion status, but qualified by a provision that the existence and the rights of the government of Northern Ireland must be both recognized and respected. This de Valera's rejected on July the 21st. Although leaving the truce intact and the door open for further discussion. Through the weeks in negotiations between London, Dublin, and Belfast, the Prime Minister kept the King fully informed and in turn received wholehearted encouragement. Then came a check at the end of July. The British press reprinted an interview supposedly given to an American newspaper by Lord Northcliffe, the proprietor of both the Times and the Daily Mail, who in failing health had just begun a world tour. It purported to reveal a sharp division of opinion between the king and his prime minister on Irish policy. Here, at its most sensitive passage, it is not generally known that under the constitutional form of government, the king has still a good deal of power when he chose to use it. In this case, he has done so with good effect. At the last meeting he had with Lloyd George before leaving for Ireland, the king asked him, "Are you going to shoot all the people in Ireland?" "No, your majesty," the premier replied. "Well then," said the king, "you must come to some agreement with them. This thing cannot go on. I cannot have my people killed in this manner." When King George sailed for Ireland, the cabinet tried to spike his efforts by making speeches in the Lords and the Commons 3 hours afterwards, which were intended to irritate the Irish people. This annoyed the English people very much, and when the king returned, he had the biggest reception outside of Buckingham Palace he had ever received since the war began in August 1914. The authenticity of the interview was once repudiated by both Northcliffe and his traveling companion, Wickham Steed, editor of the Times. Fatigued by the hot weather, Northcliffe had authorized Steed to give interviews in his name. It was Steed, not Northcliffe, who had in fact spoken to the man from the New York Times. In a public disclaimer, Steed made it plain that since he could not have possessed any knowledge of what passed between the king and the prime minister, he could not have quoted their conversation. As to the conduct of the reporter from the New York Times, it was not a question of violation of confidence, which would have been bad enough. I never said it at all. Lloyd George, too, made a statement in the Commons on behalf of both himself and the king. He denied that any such reported conversation between them had taken place, and he confirmed that the king, in his Belfast speech, had followed the invariable constitutional practices relating to speeches from the throne at Westminster. Destroyed by that chorus of denials, the supposedly fake interview faded from contemporary interests. We, however, may pursue it a little longer. For in 1952, the authorized History of Times revealed that part, at least, of that interview had been based on a conversation between Steed and the reporter about the king's desire for peace in Ireland and his solicitude for all his people. A talk with Steed regarded a private and off the record, but which the American journalist felt at liberty to print. What the king was alleged to have said about the bloodshed in Ireland, moreover, carries a ring of truth and confirms to similar reproaches which we now know he addressed to his ministers. Even his supposed choice of words, "I cannot have my people killed," foreshadowed a celebrated rebuke 10 years later. "Remember, Mr. Gandhi, I won't have any attacks on my empire." Steed's alleged reference to the king's resentment at disobliging ministerial speeches on the eve of his visit to Belfast was, as we have seen, equally well-founded. If not from Steed, where did the New York Times reporter gain so accurate an insight into the king's relationship with his ministers? And if indeed it was Steed who had talked so freely, what was his own authoritative source? The probable answer to the first question is that the American journalist, far from reporting Steed inaccurately, had reported him with embarrassing fidelity, private confidences, as well as public platitudes. The probable answer to the second question is that to be found in a diary of Lloyd George's secretary, Francis Stevenson, who always referred to him as D for David. He then sent for Lord Stanfordham and found out in his course of discussion that Lord S. had seen Wickham Steed and had obviously been talking to him in such a way as to give him the impression that the king and D had been at variance, and that is the explanation of the interview. D was simply furious. Lloyd George's anger was understandable. For months he had endured a campaign of denigration waged against him by the Times. Only 2 weeks earlier, Steed had referred to him in print as the most distrusted statesman in Europe, without straightforwardness or honor. And this was the newspaper editor with whom the king's private secretary had apparently chosen to gossip about his master's relationship with the prime minister a few hours after their painful confrontation at Downing Street. Stanfordham wrote to assure the prime minister that his only motive in seeing Steed before his departure for New York had been to enlist his support for the government in giving practical effect to the king's Belfast speech. It is doubtful whether Lloyd George was mollified or Stanfordham aware of his imprudence. Their mutual regard, never more than tepid, grew positively glacial for the rest of their lives. That quarrel, however, cast no shadow over the king's support for Lloyd George throughout the resumed negotiations with de la Vera. In these, the king played more than a passive role. Over hot-tempered, over small interruptions to his daily routine, he could demonstrate an enviable restraint in affairs of state. When de Valera seemed by the end of August to be deliberately obstructing progress, some of Lloyd George's colleagues pressed the prime minister to impose a time limit on the Irish leader. The draft reply to de Valera, which the prime minister submitted for the king's approval, was not quite an ultimatum, but its aggressive tone did not satisfy the king. By then, both he and Lloyd George were on holiday in the Highlands of Scotland. They met at Moy Hall in Inverness, where the king was staying with Mackintosh, head of the ancient Scottish family. The king urged the prime minister to remove all threats and contentious phrases from the draft. The amended letter, endorsed by the cabinet at an emergency meeting in Inverness, it proved acceptable to de Valera, who agreed to resume the suspended talks. That was the king's last contribution to the Anglo-Irish discussions, except to warn the prime minister against becoming enmeshed in haggles over terminology. On 6 December, he had the joyful task of congratulating his ministers on having signed an agreement establishing the Irish Free State as a dominion with the Commonwealth. It is mostly due to the Prime Minister's patience and conciliatory spirit, the king wrote in his diary. And it is a great feather in his cap. I trust that now, after several centuries, there may be peace in Ireland. His hope proved illusory. The king did not live to see the final severance of every tie that bound the Irish Free State to the Commonwealth. But throughout the remaining years of his reign, he was an anguished yet impotent witness to the broken promises and crude stratagems, to civil war and sectarian violence and bloodshed. What fools we were not to accept Gladstone's Home Rule Bill, he told Ramsay MacDonald in 1930. The empire now would not have had the Irish Free State giving us so much trouble and pulling us to pieces. And that is the end of this section on King George V and the Irish Home Rule. As we know, it went on to have a lot more complications with Ireland all the way into the Troubles of the 1970s. We know Lord Louis Mountbatten was killed in Sligo, Ireland, assassinated, I would say, and he was King Charles's mentor and uncle, great uncle. So it had some very, very lasting effects that tie all the way back to royal family members. But I just want to highlight one movie that Michael Collins, and it had Liam Neeson in it, and it was a 1996 film. So I'm going to show you the name of the film. Okay, I watched this film, and it is a good film, and it's a very good portrayal with Liam Neeson, and let's read the plot. So, and it's a very good film, very well written, directed by Neil Jordan, as Liam Neeson, Aidan Quinn, Stephen Ray, Alan Rickman. We know him from the Harry Potter movie. He played the professor that was sort of an antagonist to Harry Potter. This is at the close of the Easter Rising in 1916. The besieged Irish Republicans surrendered to the British Army at the Republican headquarters in Dublin. Several key figures of the Rising include Patrick Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, Tom Clark, James Connolly. All are executed by a firing squad. Okay. But Eamon de Valera is spared from execution due to his American citizenship, but is imprisoned alongside Michael Collins and Harry Boland. This, okay, I won't read any further, but this was a really good film. And if anybody ever goes to Dublin, the city of Dublin, they will see, like, in some of the buildings, there are bullet holes from this Easter Rising. And I have a lot I could say about it. I have been to Dublin. I loved it there, but it's got such a rich history. I've been to the Phoenix Park in Dublin and I really enjoyed it, but Dublin has a very, very long history. Uh, and Ireland has a long and very complicated history with England. So, and then because of the history that goes back into the 1600s, when England started placing English people into the Northern Ireland part and displacing its peers, its Irish peers, and taking their land, there's a long entrenched settlement of English people in Northern Ireland. So Belfast is another good city to go visit, just in the city of Belfast, and you get to see such a difference. And I wanted to check out that both cities of Belfast. And I actually went to Dublin during the week of King Charles's coronation. Of course, I didn't say anything to the Dublin people because we kept our royalty interest in the coronation on the down low because of the complications. But I did happen to go to Ireland the following year and I wanted to see what Belfast was like. And a year later, literally more than a year later, they still had coronation signs, congratulate, like all the coronation signs for King Charles III up in Belfast. And Belfast's countryside is so much more beautiful, I think, than Ireland, but it's very fascinating. It's a beautiful. They don't not call it the Emerald Isle. They don't call Ireland the Emerald Isle for nothing. And in July, if you need a nice vacation that's not too hot, I advocate for Ireland because it was beautiful, and it's got the Guinness beer. It's got the city of Dublin is a very walkable city. It's got so much history. The Dublin Castle is very good. I would check that out. Um, Again, it's got an intriguing history. But I'll wrap things up, and I am going to be talking in my next episode about the money that King George V received during his reign when it came to the civil list. They too had their civil list allowance cut back during the war. And just as an insight, he would receive £64,000, but in 1921 it fell to £44,000 from the Duchy of Lancaster, and that was due to the war. But the Queen used to receive £10,000 originally, and then the Prince of Wales received money. And they received this money from the civil list. The Prince of Wales, which was Edward at the time, he received money from the Duchy of Cornwall, and the money he received was £80,000 a year, whereas his younger brothers only received £10,000 a year when they came of age. But their sister, Princess Mary, she received £10,000 a year and £15,000 when she married. Oh no, that was the brothers. They received £10,000 a year and then £15,000 a year when they married. And their brothers were Prince Henry and Prince George, who then married Princess Marina. And Prince Mary, who was the only daughter of King George V, she received £6,000. So that's going to be my next topic, and I'm going to talk about that in the next episode. Thank you very much for listening. Um, check out this movie, Michael Collins. It's a fascinating movie. He received I think he's a great actor, but he received a Best Actor award. So I think it's very interesting, and it talks about the Irish War of Independence and some of the little IRA moments and all that. So it's a little bit of an insight. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.